Mr. Speaker, I ask unanimous consent to speak out of order for the purpose of inquiring to the Democratic Caucus Chair the schedule for the week to come.
Without objection.
Thank you, Mr. Speaker. I ask unanimous consent to revise and extend my remarks.
Without objection.
Thank you, Mr. Speaker. I yield to my friend, Mr. Jeffries from New York, the Democrat Caucus Chair.
Thank you, Mr. Speaker. I also thank my distinguished colleague for yielding. Scheduled next week on Wednesday, the House will meet at 12 p.m. for morning hour, 2 p.m. for legislative business, with votes postponed until 6:30 p.m. On Thursday, we'll meet at 10 a.m. for morning hour and 12 p.m. for legislative business. On Friday, the House will meet at 9 a.m. for legislative business. Next week, we'll be considering a continuing resolution, very important, to fund the government. We know the fiscal year concludes on September 30th, something that we have to get done. It's also our expectation that we may consider legislation to reform the Stock Act, and then we'll also consider bills under suspension of the rules. The complete list of suspension bills will be announced by the close of business tomorrow. And then, of course, additional legislative items are possible.
I thank my colleague, and we have seen movement in the Senate. Understand that there's activity over there. Do you have an update on, number one, when we might see that legislation in the House, but more importantly, when we might see legislative text?
Well, the Senate has apparently moved for cloture on Tuesday. So one, it's our expectation that we're going to have an opportunity to vote to make sure that we fund the government beyond September 30th. In terms of legislative text, the negotiations are ongoing. I think everyone is working in good faith. We're thankful for the leadership on our side of Chairwoman Rosa DeLauro. We have a responsibility to make sure that we keep the government open, and we intend to keep that responsibility.
Mr. Speaker, I'd like to ask my colleague if he is aware of any other additional authorizing text that may be attached to the continuing resolution.
Well, there are ongoing negotiations in good faith. There have been several exigencies that have arisen, but I don't have visibility into the actual precise nature of the negotiations right now. As I mentioned, on our end, certainly they're being handled by Chairwoman Rosa DeLauro, but I know those negotiations are progressing. We expect that an agreement is going to be reached, hopefully in the next few days, and then, of course, you'll have an opportunity, as will all members, to review the legislative text.
I thank the gentleman. One final thing. Leader Hoyer made an announcement this summer that we were going to try to close votes in a timely fashion. And as we've just seen, it is virtually impossible to do it with proxy voting because these 4 votes took almost 2 hours to complete. And given that the business community is getting back to normal, we're seeing workers return to work, we're seeing businesses return to normal operations, and given that the President proclaimed that the pandemic is over, do you also expect to end proxy voting next week when the current covered period ends?
Well, that's a decision that ultimately will be made by the Speaker in consultation with other members of leadership, but being guided by the public health professionals. The Capitol physician has guided the decision up until this point in terms of the public health emergency that we've been under and what the appropriate protocols are to make sure that that we're being responsible. And in terms...
If the gentleman will yield...
I'll yield.
Mr. Speaker, I think, America expects Congress to lead. And we're seeing, again, across the nation, people get back to their lives, get back to normal. Certainly there are many safe precautions that have been taken, but clearly showing up to work is something that Americans expect Congress to do. And I just cannot think of a reason why members of this body, while we get on airplanes and fly back and forth to our districts every week, and while I see so many of our members on both sides of the aisle, attending events and speaking at various functions, and certainly they are not campaigning remotely. I can't think of a reason why we wouldn't do away with proxy voting and show up here in the people's house in person. And Mr. Speaker, I would love to see if my colleague from New York has any insight into that.
Yeah, well, I think the gentleman raises a very important observation that the American people expect us to lead, and I think during the 117th Congress, that's absolutely what has been done. We have led by passing the American Rescue Plan, saved the economy from perhaps collapsing into a recession, if not worse, put shots in arms, money in pockets, kids back in school. We've led by passing the Infrastructure Investment and Jobs Act, creating millions of good-paying jobs, fixing our crumbling bridges, roads, and tunnels. Gentleman asked the question, I'm just responding.
I know, and if the gentleman will, I'll reclaim my time here for just a minute, but we're failing miserably in American energy independence with the rise of home heating costs and fuel, and we see what's happened to our neighbors in the European Union. We see the rising cost, and certainly Americans are worried about that. The rising cost of rent, the out-of-control inflation, the excessive government spending. I mean, we have that, but more importantly, we have our communities that are less safe because of the crisis at the border, the fentanyl crisis that's hitting every single county.
Will the gentleman yield?
Just a minute. So I don't know that we have been leading, but I want to, Mr. Speaker, go back to the specifics of the question that we ask here in terms of leading by showing up to work. I just want to see if there's any kind of rational reason why we shouldn't show up in person to work. Now, with that, I'd love to hear from my colleague from New York.
Well, I think, one, we've been operating under a public health emergency, but in the constraints of that, again, following the guidance of the public health professionals, that's how we've been operating. And certainly the gentleman, well, I think you've yielded the time to me, so I can yield it back to you at the appropriate time. But as you've indicated, I think to my colleague from New York, I'll reclaim the time. I think I'll reclaim the time here. But the president ended the pandemic, declared that it was over. So if that's the case, then shouldn't we be going back to normal, Mr. Speaker? Again, we're going to follow the public health guidance, and out of courtesy, we are having this colloquy, but we can't have a colloquy if the gentleman is dissatisfied with my answers and such that you're consistently not permitting me to respond. I'd be happy to respond to any questions if we're going to have a colloquy. And I think what is clear, if the point is, are we leading? Correct, we're leading. As I mentioned, we're leading on the American Rescue Plan. We're leading on infrastructure investment. We're leading on standing up for our veterans, leading on public safety, leading on passing gun safety legislation, leading on the Chips and Science Act,
Mr.
and leading on reducing
I'll reclaim my
inflation
time
costs.
because clearly, we see some of these important issues differently. Just sticking to the main question of proxy voting and why members of Congress should not show up to do their job. American businesses we can campaign in person. Certainly voting in person seems reasonable to me. But with that, I would like to thank my colleague, the caucus chair, for his time today and for setting the schedule. And with that, I yield.